Now we're here, time to talk about Chapter 11, which is Scene Size Up. Your safety comes first. So in the scene size up, you need to evaluate all aspects of being safe. So here are the elements, the components of the scene size up. First of all, you need to check for scene safety. Then you need to take standard precautions, including putting on personal protective equipment. Note the mechanism of injury or the nature of illness. Determine the number of patients, and then decide if you need additional resources or not. So 5 things that you need to do when you do a scene size up. Scene safety. There's nothing very predictable about scenes. In an emergency, it's a chaotic situation and there's lots of dangers that might be present. When you start to go to a motor vehicle accident and go to a collision scene, you start looking for other emergency vehicles and paying attention from what direction they're coming. You don't want to get into an accident, especially with another emergency vehicle. Just because you have lights on doesn't mean you have the right of way. Then, once you get there, look for signs of a collision-related power outage. Might be power lines down, and that would pose a safety hazard for you. Look at traffic flow. Set up cones to protect yourself so that motor vehicles slow down and don't get into more accidents. Look for smoke in the direction of the collision. Make sure there isn't a potential for fire or explosion. When you start getting close to the scene, you can look for clues that maybe there might be hazardous material. If there's hazardous materials, you don't want to park too close. All scenes will have a danger zone. Look on page 265 and read about how large the danger zone should be extended. If it's a hazardous spill, you want it to be at least 100 feet in all directions from the wreckage. Look for collision victims on or near the road. Look for smoke. If you don't see it in a distance, maybe you should get closer. Look for utility poles. There might be downed wires. Watch for people that are walking alongside the road toward the collision scene. Some people just come in to be bystanders and watch, and some people think they're going to help, and maybe even patients wandering around not knowing where to go. So look for police officers and other emergency people. Everybody needs to be safe at a scene. As you reach the scene, follow the instructions of anybody that's there before you, any personnel, and then put on your appropriate protective apparel. You will need head protection, bunker coat, and an ANSI approved reflective vest over your coat. Those are required. You can be fined if you're not wearing reflective coats. We have them in all of our units, so be sure and put them on. Establish a danger zone around the wreckage of every vehicle collision. If you don't see any hazards, anything apparent, in this case, you can make the danger zone to extend about 50 feet in all directions. Make sure you park outside the danger zone, away from glass, away from any flares that are protecting the scene. If you see there's fuel that's been spilled, your danger zone should be at least 100 feet in all directions from any wreckage and fuel. If a vehicle is on fire, at least 100 feet in all directions. You need to also park upwind or uphill from any type of smoke or wind. When wires are down, park at least one full span of wires away from the poles to which broken wires attach to. And when hazmat is involved, be sure and get out your emergency response guidebook, the yellow hazmat book, and identify what the substance is and park the appropriate distance that's listed in there. Crime scenes. and acts of violence. If there's fighting or loud voices and you're approaching the scene, or if you see the potential for fighting, there's a good chance that this can turn on you. Even if they're people you know, people react strangely. Um, so leave the scene. If there's any potential for any unsafe thing happening to you, then leave. If you see weapons, at any time you observe a weapon, you need to use an extreme amount of caution. Uh, just leave the scene. Get away. Always leave a way that you can exit. Don't lock yourself in or back yourself into a corner. If you see signs of alcohol or other drug use, these are very unpredictable scenes, and you don't know how these people will react. And another thing, if there's an unusual silence, most emergencies are very active and noisy. If it's too quiet, there's something suspicious about that. So be extra cautious. If you know that this is a place that is prone to violence, most people know the areas and the places in town, or you may have been to a particular location where you may have had problems before. Be careful of these scenes. So, although any call can present a potential safety hazard, there's what types of calls might pose the highest threats for potential violence. Think about it. Which ones can be violent? Well, whenever there's domestic abuse or child abuse, or if there's at a bar or drugs and alcohol involved, these have the potential for people to become violent. People's behavior changes when they're under the influence and or when their emotions are um, on one spectrum, a very, very excited spectrum. So be careful of these types. Standard precautions is another part of scene safety. That means you have to take body substance isolation by using personal protective equipment and protect yourself from getting any type of disease. Nature of call. Determine why you were called in the first place. And to do that, we look at mechanism of injury or nature of illness. So mechanism of injury, it's what causes an injury. It's the force or forces that have been applied that have caused injury. So there's different types out there. You can have blunt trauma or you can have penetrating trauma. There's different types of motor vehicle collisions, and all of them have statistics as to whether or not they are bring severe injury or even minor injuries. Nature of illness is for medical calls, determining what is wrong with the person that they called you today. So mechanism of injury. These are the forces that cause the injury. Understanding these forces can predict injury patterns. Look on page 270, and there's a picture there of mechanism of injuries to specific parts of the bodies and what type of injuries they can have happen. So learn to understand these forces and predict the patterns. You can suspect that somebody that's hit with a baseball bat in the abdomen might potentially have some bleeding going on. If they stepped in a hole and twisted, they might have a broken or twisted ankle. So the injury patterns can be very useful in predicting injuries associated with certain types of accidents, and especially when it comes to motor vehicle collisions. The law of inertia says that that a body in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So in a motor vehicle collision, if you're going down the road, suddenly you hit a tree, you're going to be stopped. But that energy still is going somewhere as it vibrates through the vehicle. So looking at clues of the vehicle can tell you what type of injuries you might suspect. If there's a broken windshield, did they hit the windshield? Sometimes you'll see a perfect imprint of a face in a windshield and little bits of hair in the cracks. So that means that their face hit the windshield. What type of injuries? Well, that force is going to travel down and maybe provide some broken bones in the face and head and even down into the neck fractures, and obviously their chest might have hit the steering wheel if they were the driver, so there could be injuries there. Look for deformity of the steering wheel. Certain types of injuries will produce, statistically, certain types of collisions will produce certain types of injuries. Be sure to look at page 271 to also find out about the 3 collisions in a motor vehicle crash. Any motor vehicle crash, a vehicle collides when it strikes an object, and then the body inside collides when the person's body strikes the interior of the vehicle. And then the organs in the body will collide when the person's organs strike the interior surfaces of the body. So all that energy goes on. Head-on collisions. 2 different type of patterns. There can be an up and over or a down and under pattern. In the up and over pattern, the pathway is up and over the steering wheel, and they'll strike their head on the windshield. Especially if they haven't been wearing a seatbelt, this is going to cause head and neck injuries. In a down and under, the patient's body follows a pathway that goes down underneath the steering wheel, and they strike their knees on the dash, causes the knee, leg, and hip to be injured. You can look for other clues too that will impact the injuries, like did the airbags go off? Were they wearing a seatbelt? Was there anything in the car? Here's a starred windshield. This is how windshields shatter. They usually stay intact, but you can tell that an object has hit that windshield, probably a head. So what type of injuries might that person have? Head and neck. So other types of motor vehicle collisions. You can have a rear end collision. These are common causes of neck and head injuries. Side impact collisions, broadside or T-bones. These collisions have have other injury patterns, but since the head tends to remain still on the body gets pushed out from under it towards the side, and the neck is not used to being moved sideways and can have some neck injuries. The head, chest, abdomen, pelvis, and thighs can get struck directly, which causes skeletal and internal injuries. Sometimes the organs, like the lungs that have bronchus that they're attached to, can be sheared off, causing some massive air in the chest cavity. Rollover collisions, these are the most serious because there's multiple impacts here. Especially if the person is not seat belted, they can be injected. They can also be hit by other objects that are loose in the vehicle. And then there's rear end collisions. Rear end collisions can be pretty critical as far as whiplash and impact from the back, especially as this car looks like it was hit pretty significantly. Here's a side impact. This is T-boned. The person that was hit there had direct impact. The other thing to look at is that there's more than 12 inches of intrusion into the passenger compartment. This signifies a critical impact. A rollover. And a lot of people carry a lot of stuff in their vehicles. Whatever's in the vehicle is going to kind of get rolled around with it and hit the person that's inside. So our motor vehicle collisions, the rotational impact collisions, the cars are struck and then they spin around, and the initial impact often causes subsequent impacts, especially if it's in a pretty busy road traffic area. Other types of mechanism of injuries, falls. Um, if an adult falls more than 20 feet, this is automatically considered a critical fall. If a child under 15 years old is more than 10 feet, which is 2 to 3 times the child's height, then this is also considered a critical fall. And that's because the higher they get, the more chance they have of getting hurt. The other things you look at is what type of surface did they land on? Was it soft? Was it, um, you know, sandy versus cement? There's different types of surfaces, and that can also impact the damage. How did they land? On their feet, on their side, on their head? So this might be a critical fall depending on where he fell from. If he just tripped and fell, that might not be quite as critical, although looking at the way he's laying, he may have fallen from the top of the roof, maybe where he might have been working. So, some important things to look at with falls: the height from which the patient fell, the surface the patient fell onto, part of patient that hit the surface, and anything that interrupted the fall. If they fell off of a roof and then they hit an air conditioning unit on the third story as they fell, that might impact some mechanisms, their mechanism of injury too. A penetrating trauma. This is anything that goes into the body and causes a laceration or a tear through the skin. This, these are classified by the velocity of the item, either a low velocity or a high velocity. Low velocity would be anything like a knife injury, and on this type of injury, you would have damage generally around the penetrated area. But be careful, you might have multiple wounds. For instance, somebody might have been stabbed multiple times. But take a look at the size of the object that penetrated them and how deep it might potentially go. Medium velocity would be a handgun or shotgun, and high velocity would be a rifle. And then these injuries might be anywhere on the body. But you're not only going to have on the high velocity damage directly from whatever projectile, bullet, or whatever went through, but you might have damage which are pressure related to the spinning or the fragmenting of the bullet. So the tissue around it will also be damaged. So blunt force trauma is caused by a blow that strikes the body but doesn't actually penetrate the skin or any body tissues. The energy from the force blow will still travel through the body, and it causes serious injury and even ruptures internal organs and vessels. This is where bruises might come from. But think about it if it's a severe blunt force. It may actually compromise body functions or have severe hemorrhage, or even if it's a hollow organ like the bladder or something, that stuff can actually spill into the body and cause some severe infections. You don't always see these signs right away. They can be subtle and you might not see them to begin with. So you might just see reddening of the skin in the area where the blow happened. You might see a bluish discoloration or bruising that may start, but if it was pretty recent, it takes a while before a bruise starts. We all have had bruises before, and we know it just doesn't happen within minutes. So, with your blunt force trauma, you have to look at what type of injury and how did it occur, and maintain that index of suspicion based on what the mechanism was. So, for nature of illness, you want to think about or even ask, why did the patient call EMS? People can be sick, and sometimes people are sick for hours or even days before they call an ambulance. If that's the case, you want to know what changed. If they've had chest pain for 5 days, well, what changed today that you called right now? Did it get worse? Did you start vomiting with it? or what actually caused you to finally call. So, during the scene size up, you need to scan the entire scene. If it's somebody that's been sick for a while, maybe you might see used tissues or a trash can close by that they've been vomiting in, or you can see signs where they've been lying in bed for a long time. So look at your patients. Look for any additional patients. Look around, see if there's any other pedestrians or cyclists or anything going on. You can get information from a lot of people, not just the patient, although the patient should be your main source, but family members or bystanders also can give you some very good clues as to what's going on, especially if they know the person fairly well. Look at the scene and the surroundings and see if you can see any medicines around that might give you clues. You also need to know how many patients you have and do you have enough resources to care for them? Because this is during your scene size up is a good time to figure out, do I need somebody to help me carry this 425-pound patient out? Um, or maybe you suddenly have developed a second patient. We recently went to a call for a patient that wasn't feeling well in the middle of the night, and when we got there, her husband wasn't feeling well either. And so we thought there might be the potential for carbon monoxide poisoning. Um, and so we got him out, but it also provided two patients instead of just one. Do we have enough personnel on hand for that? Um, you might see that you're called to an accident scene and you find one more patient lying in the ditch. Do you have the sufficient resources to care for all the patients? Then, does the situation require any special resources? Maybe you need fire to come and to, help with any safety issues, traffic control, potential for fire, hazmat spill, might need a technical rescue of some sort, either water rescue or a high uh, some rope rescue type thing, hazardous materials response. Do we have the correct resources to deal with that? So in review, scene size up is the first part of your patient assessment, and it's a continual process. Don't just go and assess the scene and then forget to look for other hazards. You might come across a scene that looked safe initially, and then suddenly you find all kinds, when you get to the patient, you find all kinds of needles and stuff lying about. That makes it a little bit hazardous. Nobody wants to get poked with a needle. It's important during your scene size up to determine what, if any, threats there may be to your own safety and to the safety of others at the scene. Then take appropriate standard precautions. Next, it's important to determine the nature of the call by identifying the mechanism of injury or what's going on that the patient called you for today. What is their illness? Finally, you must take into account the number of patients and other factors at the scene to determine if you need additional help. Do this early on, because if you wait, you may have to sit there a while for your people to get there. So take note and get your additional resources coming while you're doing other things. Determine what, if any, threats there may be to your own safety and to the safety of others. You are responsible for your safety first, the safety of your crew, and then your patient, and then bystanders, in that order. So take appropriate standard precautions, keep gloves on, do infection control, if you need a mask, if you need a gown, if you need goggles, all of these personal protective equipment needs to be utilized. Determine the nature of the call by identifying the mechanism of injury or the nature of the patient's illness. Determine the number of patients and any additional resources necessary. So, for each of these dangers, what actions must be taken to remain safe at a collision scene? If you have leaking gasoline, how far away do you want to park? What type of personal protective equipment might you need? What type of resources do you need? If you've got toxic or hazardous material spill, what type of resources do you need for that? Who would you call? Where is our closest hazmat people? What should we wear? How far away should we park? And if your vehicle is on fire, do we need the fire department if you don't have them there? Or uh, maybe we need to page for additional personnel. Downed power lines, staying how far away from them? And what about resources? Who do we need? And how long is it going to take for them to get there? So what are common mechanism of injury patterns for the following situations? A head-on collision. Well, remember we have our up and over or our down and under. Up and over is going to give upper head and neck injuries. Down and under are your legs and hips. Rear end collision, pretty significant for neck injuries as you're propelled forward and whiplash back. Fall from a height. So depends on how high the fall was, how tall the patient is, and what surface they landed on, and what body part hit. So you're called to the scene of a shooting at a fast food restaurant. En route, you plan your scene size up strategy. What actions do you anticipate taking when you arrive? All right, so there's a shooting. First thing should be is your safety. Where is the assailant? You need to park far enough away from the scene to make sure it's secured. You don't carry guns. Police do. So make sure the police are going to arrive there first. And when they tell you they've got the assailant in handcuffs, then it's the time to go. And once it's safe, then once you're there, well, there might be significant blood loss in a shooting, significant impact from bullet wounds, depending on where the bullets went through, what kind of gun it was. Was it a high velocity or medium velocity? Is it a bullet that fragments and does more damage in the body? All of these are factors to take into arrival. You need to have on personal protective equipment. This could be significant bloody scene, and so take measures to protect yourself there. All this before you even have to take care of the patient. Scene safety is first.